"Your panties are ugly," my husband said in public. I took revenge with one final choice. He laughed, loud enough for everyone to hear. One careless sentence was all it took to humiliate me in front of people I trusted. I smiled, stayed quiet, and let him believe he'd won. What he didn't know was that embarrassment can turn into clarity, and clarity into strategy. I didn't scream. I didn't confront him that night. I made a decision instead, one that would cost him far more than his pride, and give me back something I'd lost for years. If this story helps you recognize when a single moment reveals everything you need to know, please leave a like and subscribe. There are moments when disrespect becomes so public and so casual that it reveals truths you've been avoiding for years. When humiliation delivered carelessly in front of witnesses forces you to confront exactly how little value your partner places on your dignity or feelings. The night my husband Derek made a crude joke about my underwear at a dinner party with our closest friends, loud enough for the entire table to hear, laughing at his own humor while I sat frozen in mortification, that was the moment everything crystallized. Not just that comment, but every dismissive remark before it, every subtle degradation, every instance where Derek had treated my feelings and dignity as acceptable casualties for his entertainment. In that moment of public humiliation, I didn't make a scene or confront him. I made a decision, one that would cost him far more than embarrassment, and give me back the self-respect I'd been sacrificing for years. My name is Nina Alvarez, and I'm 38 years old. I'd been married to Derek for 13 years when this incident occurred, 13 years during which I'd slowly normalized his pattern of making jokes at my expense, dismissing my feelings, treating me as acceptable target for humor that was cruel even when he claimed it was just teasing. Derek was the kind of person who valued being seen as funny and entertaining above almost everything else, who would sacrifice anyone's dignity, including mine, if it got a laugh, who genuinely seemed to believe that my hurt feelings about his jokes were me being too sensitive rather than him being genuinely cruel. The pattern had started small early in our relationship, Derek making light sarcastic comments about things I said or did, framing them as affectionate teasing when I expressed hurt. Over the years, the comments had escalated in cruelty, while Derek's dismissal of my objections remained constant. He'd mock my career choices in front of colleagues, make jokes about my body or my habits in front of friends, tell embarrassing stories about me to people we'd just met as icebreaker entertainment. Every time I tried to tell him these things hurt me, that I needed him to stop treating me as comedic material, Derek would say I was being too sensitive, that everyone teases their spouse, that his jokes were expressions of affection that I was interpreting wrong. I'd internalized this framing over years of being told my hurt was me being unreasonable rather than Derek being unkind. I'd started doubting my own reactions, wondering if maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe this was just how spouses treated each other. Maybe my expectations for basic respect and dignity were unrealistic. The slow erosion of my boundaries and self-advocacy had happened so gradually that I didn't realize how much of myself I'd sacrificed to avoid being labeled as "can't take a joke," until the moment Derek's cruelty became so public, I couldn't rationalize it anymore. The dinner party that would become the turning point was at our friend's house, Marcus and Jenna, a couple we'd known for years, people we saw regularly and who were part of our core social circle. Also present were two other couples we were friendly with, making it a group of 10 people total, including Derek and me. It was supposed to be a casual evening of good food and conversation, the kind of low-key social gathering we all enjoyed and participated in regularly. Everything was pleasant and normal through dinner and into the evening. Conversations ranged over various topics: work stories, political discussions, funny anecdotes about kids or pets. Derek was in good form, telling entertaining stories, making people laugh, being the charismatic, entertaining person that had attracted me to him initially, before I'd understood that his humor often came at other people's expense. The incident happened after dinner when we'd moved to the living room for coffee and dessert. I'd been sitting on the couch, gotten up to refill my coffee, and when I bent slightly to set down my cup, my shirt rode up in the back slightly, revealing the waistband of my underwear for maybe a second before I adjusted my clothes. It was completely innocuous, the kind of momentary exposure that happens to everyone and that polite people pretend not to notice. But Derek noticed. And instead of pretending not to notice like a respectful human would, he decided it was comedy gold. "Nina, your panties are showing," he announced loudly to the entire room. "And they're ugly as hell. What are those granny panties from the discount bin?" He laughed at his own joke, a loud performative laugh designed to signal to everyone else that this was hilarious and they should join in. The room went completely silent. Everyone looked uncomfortable, some looking at Derek with expressions that were clearly disapproving, others looking at me with sympathy or embarrassment on my behalf, nobody laughing at Derek's joke the way he clearly expected them to. I felt my face burning with humiliation, felt the weight of 10 people suddenly focused on me and my underwear that Derek had just publicly mocked, felt something inside me break in a way that was going to be permanent. "Derek, that's not—" Jenna started to say, clearly trying to redirect the conversation and ease the awkwardness Derek had created. But Derek interrupted her, doubling down on his joke instead of reading the room and backing off. "What? I'm just saying, if I'd known she was wearing those granny panties, I would have warned her to keep her shirt tucked in," Derek continued, still laughing like this was the funniest thing in the world. "Next time we're going underwear shopping, I'm picking them out because clearly Nina's taste in panties is as bad as—" He was going to continue, going to make another cruel comparison, but Marcus cut him off. "Derek, stop," Marcus said firmly, his voice carrying authority that made Derek actually pause. "That's inappropriate and disrespectful. You need to apologize to Nina." Marcus's intervention was appreciated and appropriate, but it also made the moment even more humiliating. Now, I was someone who needed defending, someone whose husband was so cruel that friends had to intervene, someone whose dignity had been so violated that bystanders felt compelled to step in. Derek looked surprised by Marcus's reaction, clearly not understanding why his joke hadn't landed the way he'd intended. "Oh, come on. I'm just teasing," he said defensively. "Nina knows I'm kidding. She's not that sensitive." He looked at me expectantly, waiting for me to confirm that yes, I knew he was kidding. Yes, I wasn't hurt. Yes, I would play my assigned role of good sport who can take a joke even when the joke is public humiliation. I could have played that role. I'd played it hundreds of times before, laughing along with Derek's cruel jokes, minimizing my hurt, accepting his framing that I was being too sensitive when I objected, prioritizing his comfort and his image over my own dignity. But something was different this time. Maybe it was the public nature of the humiliation. Maybe it was Marcus's intervention making it clear that outside observers recognized Derek's comment as genuinely inappropriate rather than just me being oversensitive. Maybe it was just 13 years of accumulated cruelty finally exceeding my capacity to rationalize or minimize. Whatever the reason, I didn't play my assigned role. I stood up calmly, picked up my purse, and said clearly to the room, "I'm leaving. Derek, you can get a ride home with someone else or you can call an Uber. I'll see everyone another time." Then I walked out of the house, got in our car, and drove home, leaving Derek to face the social consequences of his cruelty without me there to smooth things over or minimize his behavior. The drive home, I felt surprisingly calm. No tears, no anger, just cold, clear recognition that something fundamental had changed. Derek had humiliated me publicly once too often, had crossed a line in front of witnesses that made his pattern of cruelty undeniable, even to my own rationalizations. And more importantly, I'd recognized in that moment that I didn't have to accept this treatment, didn't have to laugh along with jokes at my expense, didn't have to prioritize Derek's comfort over my own dignity. I could simply leave, and that's what I'd done. When Derek arrived home about an hour later, someone had given him a ride. He was angry in ways he tried to frame as me being unreasonable. "You embarrassed me in front of our friends," he said accusingly. "Walking out like that made me look like an asshole. Everyone was uncomfortable after you left. Why couldn't you just take a joke like a normal person instead of making a huge dramatic scene?" The irony of Derek accusing me of embarrassing him when he'd publicly mocked my underwear was so absurd I actually laughed. "I embarrassed you?" I repeated. "You made a crude joke about my underwear in front of 10 people, called them ugly, mocked me when I did nothing but exist in a space with you, and I embarrassed you by leaving instead of sitting there and taking it." "It was just a joke," Derek insisted, his default defense for every cruel thing he'd ever said. "You're being way too sensitive about this. Everyone teases their spouse. You need to develop thicker skin instead of running away crying every time I make a harmless comment. The reframing was automatic and practiced. I was oversensitive. The joke was harmless. My hurt was my problem rather than his cruelty being the issue. Marcus told you to stop and apologize, I pointed out. Our friends were uncomfortable. Nobody laughed at your joke except you. So maybe the problem isn't that I'm too sensitive. Maybe the problem is that you're cruel and you've convinced yourself it's humor. Saying this out loud, clearly and firmly without qualifying or minimizing, felt powerful in ways I hadn't experienced in years. Derek and I fought for hours that night. Actual confrontation rather than me accepting his dismissal of my feelings. He maintained that I was overreacting, that his comment had been harmless teasing, that walking out had been dramatic and unnecessary. I maintained that 13 years of him making jokes at my expense, dismissing my hurt, treating my dignity as acceptable casualty for his entertainment had accumulated into damage I was no longer willing to accept. We went to bed angry, in separate rooms, the fight unresolved and the damage to our relationship feeling permanent rather than temporary. Over the next several days, I did a lot of thinking about my marriage and what I wanted. The underwear comment itself wasn't the real problem. It was a symptom of a much deeper pattern where Derek consistently prioritized his desire to be seen as funny and entertaining over my dignity and feelings. It was about him having learned over 13 years that he could treat me cruelly and I would eventually accept it, would normalize it, would play along with being the butt of his jokes because confronting him was more uncomfortable than just enduring his behavior. Friends reached out after the dinner party, Marcus and Jenna especially, both calling to check on me and to make clear that Derek's comment had been completely inappropriate, and they were sorry I'd been put in that position. Other friends who'd been there sent messages expressing similar sentiments. What became clear through these conversations was that Derek's pattern of making jokes at my expense hadn't been invisible to others. They'd noticed it for years, had been uncomfortable with it, but had either assumed I was okay with it or hadn't known how to intervene without making things worse. He's been doing this for as long as we've known you, Jenna told me during a coffee meeting a few days after the party. Making comments about you, telling embarrassing stories, treating you like comedic material. We've always thought it seemed mean, but you'd laugh along or brush it off, so we assumed maybe it was just their dynamic. But the other night, the way he doubled down when everyone was clearly uncomfortable, the way he couldn't read the room and realize he'd crossed a line, that was hard to watch. And honestly, Nina, you deserve better than being someone's punchline. Light. Hearing from an outside perspective that Derek's behavior had been obviously problematic for years was validating, but also painful. It meant I'd been tolerating obviously unacceptable treatment while everyone around me could see it was wrong. Meant I'd normalized cruelty that was recognizable as cruelty to observers. Meant I'd lost my own sense of what was acceptable in how a partner should treat me. The recognition was humiliating in different ways than Derek's comment had been. Now I was embarrassed not just by what he'd said, but by how long I'd accepted his pattern of treating me this way. I made an appointment with a therapist, Dr. Rachel Foster, to process what had happened and to figure out what I wanted to do about my marriage. Dr. Foster helped me understand that I'd been in what she described as a psychologically abusive relationship, where Derek's pattern of public humiliation and dismissal of my feelings when I objected was a form of emotional cruelty that had systematically eroded my boundaries and self-worth. When someone repeatedly hurts you and then tells you that your hurt is your problem rather than their behavior being the issue, Dr. Foster explained, that's gaslighting. Derek has spent 13 years training you to question your own reactions, to accept his framing that you're too sensitive, rather than that he's genuinely cruel. Dr. Foster helped me see that the underwear comment wasn't an isolated incident, or even the worst thing Derek had done. It was just the most recent and most publicly witnessed example of a pattern that had been ongoing throughout our marriage. She asked me to make a list of other times Derek had humiliated me or dismissed my feelings, and the list was devastatingly long. Hundreds of incidents over 13 years where Derek had prioritized getting a laugh over my dignity, where he'd made me the target of jokes that were cruel even when framed as teasing, where my objections had been dismissed as oversensitivity rather than his behavior being addressed as inappropriate. "What do you want?" Dr. Foster asked me during one session. "Not what Derek wants, not what you think you should want, but what you actually want for your life and your relationships. The question forced me to think about what I needed rather than just accepting what I'd been getting. What I wanted was basic respect and dignity. I wanted a partner who treated my feelings as important rather than as inconvenient obstacles to his entertainment. I wanted someone who would be mortified if they accidentally hurt me rather than dismissive when I expressed hurt. I wanted relationships where I felt valued and protected rather than like acceptable target for mockery. And increasingly, what I wanted was to not be married to Derek anymore, because 13 years of evidence suggested he wasn't capable of or interested in providing the kind of partnership I needed. I consulted with a divorce attorney, Sharon Martinez, about my options. Sharon explained that because we lived in a no-fault divorce state, Derek's pattern of emotional cruelty wouldn't directly affect asset division, but documentation of his behavior could be relevant to other aspects of the divorce. She recommended I start documenting Derek's pattern of dismissive and cruel comments, that I prepare financially by securing access to accounts and understanding our assets, that I think carefully about what I wanted from the divorce beyond just ending the marriage. What I wanted from the divorce was my dignity back. I wanted Derek to understand that there were consequences for treating someone cruelly, that you couldn't spend 13 years humiliating your spouse and expect them to just continue accepting it indefinitely. I wanted him to face social consequences for behavior that had been witnessed by our entire friend group, to lose the comfortable life he'd built partially on my tolerance of his cruelty. And I wanted financial settlement that reflected the fact that I'd sacrificed career advancement to support his career, had organized our household to enable his professional success, had contributed value to our marriage that went beyond just what showed up in a paycheck. Over the next 6 weeks, I prepared for divorce meticulously. I documented Derek's pattern of cruel comments and dismissive responses when I objected, including getting written statements from friends who'd witnessed his behavior at the dinner party and on other occasions. I secured independent access to our financial accounts, made copies of all relevant documents, ensured I had resources that Derek couldn't freeze or control. I consulted with Sharon about optimal timing for filing, about how to structure demands to maximize settlement. Everything I did was legal, strategic, and designed to protect my interests in ways I should have been doing years earlier. Derek didn't notice my preparations. He assumed that our fight about the underwear comment had blown over, that we'd return to our normal dynamic where eventually I'd forgive him and things would continue as they'd always been. He didn't apologize for the comment or change his behavior. If anything, he seemed to feel vindicated by what he saw as me having overreacted and eventually calmed down, confirmed in his belief that I was too sensitive and that his jokes were harmless regardless of my objections. When I finally told Derek I wanted a divorce, about 2 months after the dinner party incident, he was genuinely shocked. "Over one comment?" he asked incredulously. "You're throwing away 13 years of marriage because I made one joke about your underwear? That's completely insane, Nina. You're being ridiculously overdramatic." "This isn't about one comment," I said calmly. "This is about 13 years of you treating me cruelly, dismissing my feelings when I objected, making me the target of jokes that humiliated me publicly and privately, and refusing to take any responsibility for how your behavior affected me. The underwear comment was just the most recent and most publicly witnessed example of a pattern that's been ongoing throughout our marriage, and I'm done accepting it." Derek cycled through various responses over the following days, minimizing, "It wasn't that bad, you're exaggerating," justifying, "Everyone teases their spouse, this is normal," blaming, "If you were less sensitive, none of this would be a problem," and eventually bargaining, "I'll go to counseling. I'll be better. Please don't end our marriage over this." But none of his responses included genuine acknowledgement of how his pattern of behavior had been cruel, genuine remorse for the hurt he'd caused, or genuine commitment to fundamental change rather than just damage control. The divorce process took 11 months to finalize. Sharon fought aggressively for settlement that reflected my contributions to our marriage and the career sacrifices I'd made to support Derek's advancement. The final division gave me 58% of marital assets instead of the standard 50-50 split. Sharon had successfully argued that my career sacrifices to support Derek's career, combined with documentation of his pattern of psychological cruelty, warranted deviation from equal division. The difference was approximately $95,000 more than I would have received in standard split, money that represented compensation for years of supporting Derek's career while accepting his cruel treatment. More satisfying than the financial outcome was watching Derek face social consequences for behavior that had been witnessed and documented. Several couples from our friend group sided clearly with me after the divorce became public, told Derek explicitly that his pattern of treating me cruelly was why they were choosing to maintain friendship with me but not with him. Derek lost standing in our social circle, lost his reputation as funny guy once people started reframing his jokes as the cruelty they'd always been, faced embarrassment and social consequences he'd never faced before because I'd always minimized his behavior and maintained social normalcy despite his treatment of me. The underwear comment that had catalyzed my decision to divorce became somewhat infamous in our social circle. It was the incident people referenced when explaining why they weren't comfortable maintaining friendship with Derek, the clear example of cruelty that was undeniable even to people who might have otherwise given him benefit of doubt. Derek had wanted to be known as funny and entertaining. Instead, he became known as the guy who publicly humiliated his wife with crude jokes, and then was shocked when she left him. The reputation was his own creation, built over 13 years of behavior that had always been unacceptable, but that finally faced consequences. 18 months after the divorce finalized, I'm 39 and rebuilt into a life where my dignity isn't negotiable or contingent on someone else's approval. I've established boundaries in all my relationships, platonic and romantic, that make clear what treatment I will and won't accept. I've learned to trust my own reactions when something feels hurtful rather than accepting someone else's framing that I'm being too sensitive. I've rebuilt self-worth that had been systematically eroded by Derek's pattern of dismissing my feelings and mocking my objections. I occasionally see Derek at community events or through mutual connections, and he's always awkward and defensive, clearly uncomfortable being around the ex-wife whose dignity he'd treated as acceptable casualty for his entertainment. He's dated some but hasn't remarried, and from what I hear through friends, his relationships continue to struggle because his pattern of making cruel jokes at partners' expense hasn't fundamentally changed. The difference now is that women leave him much faster than I did, having learned from my example perhaps that tolerating cruelty isn't required even when it's framed as humor. What I learned from the underwear incident and everything that followed is that sometimes a single moment of public humiliation creates clarity that years of private hurt couldn't achieve. Being mocked in front of 10 people for something as innocuous and personal as my underwear, hearing Derek laugh at his own cruelty while everyone else sat in uncomfortable silence, watching him double down on the joke when it was clear he'd crossed a line. That moment made undeniable what I'd been rationalizing for years. Derek was cruel. His pattern of dismissing my hurt when I objected was gaslighting, and tolerating his behavior was slowly destroying my sense of self and my basic dignity. The revenge I took wasn't dramatic or vindictive in obvious ways. I didn't publicly shame Derek or destroy his reputation through active effort. What I did was stop protecting him from the natural consequences of his own behavior, stop minimizing his cruelty to make social situations comfortable, stop accepting his framing that my hurt was my problem. I left him, divorced him, let our friends make their own assessments of behavior they'd witnessed, took financial settlement that reflected my contributions and his cruelty. The cost to Derek was social standing, reputation, financial assets, and the comfortable life he'd built partially on my willingness to accept being treated as his personal punchline. The final choice I made wasn't dramatic confrontation or explosive revenge. It was quiet decision that my dignity mattered more than maintaining a marriage to someone who didn't respect it. It was recognition that I could simply leave, could stop accepting treatment that was unacceptable, could build life where being someone's target for cruel jokes wasn't my assigned role. That choice cost Derek far more than his pride. It cost him his marriage, his social circle, his reputation, and approximately $95,000 in divorce settlement. And it gave me back something I'd been sacrificing for 13 years: my self-respect, my boundaries, and my refusal to accept cruelty framed as humor. My name is Nina Alvarez. I'm 39 years old and divorced from a man who publicly mocked my underwear at a dinner party, laughed at his own cruelty, and expected me to play along with being humiliated. I didn't confront him that night. I left. And over the following months, I made decisions that were strategic, legal, and designed to protect my interests and my dignity in ways I should have been doing for years. The revenge wasn't loud or dramatic. It was precise, calculated, and permanent. And it gave me back something far more valuable than any vindication: my life, my dignity, and my refusal to ever again accept being treated as someone's punchline. Thank you for reading. If this story helped you recognize when a single moment of clarity is enough, please like and subscribe.